lost in the crowd. The cardboard box tipped, and Pip tumbled out, landing with a soft thud on the scorching pavement. Disoriented, he blinked against the sudden assault of light and noise. The air thrummed with a cacophony of shouts, honking cars, and the rhythmic chanting of vendors hawking their wares. Gone was the familiar scent of his mother, the comforting warmth of his siblings. He was alone. Panic seized him. He scrambled to his paws, a tiny orange blur against the grey concrete, and spun in a frantic circle. Where was she? He lifted his head, a plaintive mew, escaping his throat, swallowed by the roar of a passing bus. The smell of exhaust fumes stung his nostrils. He took a tentative step, then another, his small claws clicking on the hard surface. A kaleidoscope of legs rushed past, huge and unyielding. Sandals, boots, worn sneakers, a relentless, indifferent river of humanity. No one noticed the tiny orange kitten, lost and afraid. "Mamar," he cried again, his voice thin and reedy. A woman in bright pink leggings nearly tripped over him, letting out a startled shriek. She glared down at him, muttered something under her breath, and hurried on, her shopping bag swinging wildly. He darted between the legs of a fruit stand, the sweet smell of overripe mangoes momentarily distracting him from his fear. He spotted a gap beneath the wooden counter and squeezed through, finding himself in a dim, dusty space. A discarded banana peel lay on the ground, attracting a swarm of flies. It wasn't his mother, but it was shelter. Hunger gnawed at his belly. He hadn't eaten since. He couldn't remember. Everything before this swirling chaos was a hazy memory. He ventured back out, his tiny nose twitching, searching for any sign of food, any trace of familiarity. The market was a maze of sights and smells. Stalls overflowing with spices, textiles, and trinkets lined the narrow street. People jostled and pushed, their voices a constant drone. Pip, a fragile island in a sea of indifference, struggled to stay afloat. He spotted a puddle of spilled milk near a bakery. Hope flickered in his chest. He crept towards it, his stomach rumbling, but a large, scruffy dog lunged at him, barking ferociously. Pip yelped and fled, the image of the creamy liquid burned into his memory. The sun beat down on the pavement, radiating heat. He was tired, hungry, and utterly alone. He collapsed in the shadow of a parked car, his small body trembling. He closed his eyes, the sounds of the market fading into a dull hum. He was just a tiny orange kitten, lost in the crowd, and no one seemed to care. A bobcat's dilemma. A miasma of spiced fowl and overripe fruit permeated the air, a sickly sweetness that churned Rox's insides. Pressed against the cool brick of the shadowy alley, she found scant respite from the market's bedlam. A chorus of clucking poultry, the strident calls of vendors, and the low thrum of engines combined to assault her senses. Usually, she gave this place a wide berth. The sensory overload was too much. But a persistent hunger, a gnawing void in her belly, trumped her aversion. Then she noticed him. A minuscule ball of striped fluff, a miniature tiger, wobbled precariously at the edge of a produce stall overflowing with browning greens. Smaller than any rabbit she'd ever stalked, he was scarcely bigger than her own paw. His faint cries, nearly extinguished by the din, nonetheless reached Rox's keen ears. Lost, utterly alone, he radiated a palpable fear. An instinct ignited within her. Her muscles tensed, the hunter stirring to life. Easy pickings. A silent spring, a swift bite, and the emptiness would be banished. Her maw tingled. She envisioned the yielding texture of downy fur, the vital rush of warmth. But then the kitten faltered. He batted at a discarded leaf with awkward swipes, appearing impossibly small and vulnerable against the backdrop of overflowing carts and scurrying legs. His plaintive sounds struck a chord deep within Roxy, something previously unknown. She paused, conflicted. Her hunger intensified, a ravenous beast clawing at her inner being. Such was the way of the wild. Frailty was an invitation. Survival demanded she seize the advantage. Yet, the kitten, oblivious to her presence, began to tremble. The breeze, thick with the reek of refuse and exhaust, ruffled his delicate coat. He huddled into himself, his mewls diminishing to mere whispers. Roxy pressed closer to the brick, torn by the internal struggle. Every fiber of her being urged her to hunt, to kill, to endure. Still, she couldn't reconcile the image of this defenseless scrap with the gratifying crunch of bone. She'd known hunger, a deep, soul-consuming agony. She had clawed and scraped for every morsel. But this felt different, disturbingly wrong. The kitten tilted his head, his miniature, emerald eyes brimming with desperation. He took a hesitant step, then another, his cries a forlorn plea swallowed by the multitude. Roxy stiffened, claws extending involuntarily. The alley felt constricting, the air heavy with the unbearable weight of her choice. An unlikely rescue. A delicate, milky fragrance, laced with a sharp tang of fear, tickled Rox's nose. It sliced through the market's clamour, the vendors' calls, goatish cries, and the meaty reek that twisted her famished belly. She stalked toward the aroma, keeping low to the gritty ground. The spice merchant's overflowing stall, a vibrant explosion of paprika's fire, turmeric's earthiness, and cummin's pungency, seemed the epicenter. Peering through a crack in the stacked baskets, Roxy spotted it, a kitten, crammed beneath a teetering pile of woven rugs. Tiny. Frail. Helplessly tempting. Her muscles bunched, instinct clamoring for her to strike, to quell the gnawing void that had haunted her for days. A failed hunt felt like an age ago, and the kitten's slender form promised a swift, easy victory. Yet, a hesitation bloomed within her. Perhaps it was the sheer vulnerability emanating from the scrap of life, the way it quivered despite the meager shelter. Or maybe it was the immense, glistening eyes, reflecting a terror that resonated with a long-forgotten ache inside herself. Roxy crept forward, one cautious step, then another, her gait slow and measured. The kitten recoiled, emitting a soft mew, nearly swallowed by the market's din. It shrunk further into the shadows, a striped ball of fluff vibrating with fright. She paused, hunkering down. The creature was barely the size of her paw. A pitiful mouthful, really. And yet, the image of those wide, terrified eyes held her spellbound. Roxy inhaled, letting the kitten's essence flood her senses. Milk and fear, certainly, but also loneliness. Perhaps sensing a shift in Rox's intent, the kitten tentatively peeked out from under the rugs. A calico, with mismatched ears and a perpetually anxious air. It fixed Roxy with a long, searching gaze, then, with a minuscule, desperate gesture, it inched forward. It stumbled toward Roxy and nudged its head against her leg, a silent plea. The unexpected touch sent a tremor through Roxy, a bewildering mix of distaste and a strange, foreign tenderness. The kitten's fur was unbelievably soft, almost like gossamer, and its small frame trembled against hers. Roxy felt the kitten's desperation, its craving for warmth and protection. It mirrored her own desolate state, but instead of triggering a predatory response, it kindled something different altogether. Lowering her head, she nudged the kitten gently with her snout. A faint, raspy purr, a fragile vibration, stirred within Rox's chest. The choice was made. Roxy, the hunter, would now be its shield. The hollow tree home. Roxy paused, the kitten's fur carrying the reek of fishmongers and scattered spices. A fragile creature, nothing but shivering bones and imploring eyes. Instincts honed for the hunt warred with a nascent impulse, insistent and strange. She nudged it, a deep resonance rumbling from her chest. No flinch, only unwavering trust in its gaze. The decision became immutable. Abandonment here was unthinkable, not with the jostling carts, the vendors' halls, the threat of snapping jaws. Gently, Roxy lifted the kitten, her teeth careful against its delicate form. A tiny mew escaped it, a frightened sound echoing strangely within her. The market's cacophony receded as she bounded towards the hushed woods. The weight of the kitten was negligible, a small furnace against her tongue. Sunlight dripped through the canopy, painting a kaleidoscope on the forest floor. The air, thick with resin and damp earth, offered a balm to her senses after the market's assault. Deeper she went, past familiar claw marks scoring her favorite tree, across mossy stones where she often basked. Finally, she arrived, the cavity beneath the fallen oak, her sanctuary, her refuge. Usually reserved for violent weather, it felt right for this new purpose. Roxy deposited the kitten within, its miniature form momentarily swallowed by the bed of gathered leaves. It erupted, shaking its head, then surveyed its surroundings with burgeoning curiosity. The space, barely accommodating for her bulk, was secure, dry, and imbued with her scent. She observed its exploration, the tentative sniffs, the playful swats at fallen foliage. Fear lingered, evident in the way it started at each rustle, yet it was no longer alone. Roxy settled, her large body a bulwark at the entrance, a silent vow of protection. The kitten edged closer, trepidation giving way to confidence, until it nestled against her flank, a soft, vibrating purr mirroring her own rumble. An unfamiliar warmth bloomed within her as she closed her eyes. This miniature being, so utterly defenseless, was now entrusted to her care. She would shield it, nurture it, impart the wisdom of the woods. A name. It demanded a name. She gazed at the small, dark lump pressed against her. Minute as a seed, a promise of something more. Pip, as she resonated, the sound filling the small space. Your name is Pip. Pip, as if understanding, burrowed closer, its purr amplified. Roxy succumbed, the scent of kitten and soil enveloping her. The woods were tranquil, safe, and for the first time in memory, Roxy experienced a peace she had never fathomed. The Hunger Games. The gnawing in her belly was a dull ache, a constant companion, but it was Pip's cries that twisted the knife. He was a bottomless pit, a tiny, mewling void that Roxy felt responsible to fill. She had underestimated the sheer volume of sustenance required to keep a kitten growing. She crouched low, muscles coiled, watching the field mouse twitch its nose near a clump of withered grass. This was her third attempt of the morning. The first, a fat field rat, had darted into a burrow before she could even think to pounce. The second, a foolish sparrow, had taken flight with a mocking chirp as she sprung. This mouse had to be it. Roxy focused, channeling every ounce of predatory instinct she possessed. She imagined the satisfying crunch of bone, the warm burst of blood, the fleeting relief that would wash over her when Pip stopped crying. She shifted her weight, tensing for the final leap. A sudden gust of wind rustled the dry leaves, and the mouse vanished. Roxy cursed, a low, guttural growl that vibrated in her chest. Hunger, frustration, and a growing sense of desperation clawed at her. She padded back to the sheltered hollow she'd claimed as their own, her tail dragging in the dirt. Pip, oblivious to her struggles, greeted her return with a pathetic wail. His tiny pink mouth opened and closed, and his unfocused blue eyes searched for her teats. Roxy nuzzled him, trying to offer comfort, but he only cried louder. She had managed to snag a small lizard earlier. Barely enough to wet her own tongue, but she'd saved it for him. Roxy regurgitated the meager offering onto the mossy floor of their den. Pip, bless his heart, attacked it with gusto, tearing at the flesh with his needle-sharp teeth. It was gone in seconds. He looked up at her, his belly still concave, his mules now laced with a frantic edge. Roxy felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. The lizard hadn't even made a dent. He was still starving. She licked his head, a gesture of comfort she hoped he understood. She knew she had to try again. There were berries ripening further up the mountain, bitter and tart, but they would have to do. They had to. Wait here, as she rumbled, her voice rough with exhaustion. I'll be back. Pip whimpered, unconvinced. Roxy hesitated, her gaze lingering on his small, fragile form. She hated leaving him, but staying meant they both starved. The Hunger Games had begun, and she was losing. Barnaby's warning. A stale, fishy reek permeated the air, clinging to the damp earth. Roxy nudged Pip, who nibbled listlessly on a bare bone, its sustenance long depleted. Days had passed since she'd secured a proper meal. The once frisky kitten lay subdued, its coat lacking its usual sheen. Guilt gnawed at Roxy, a sharper pang than her own hunger. A deep rumble, akin to tectonic plates shifting, vibrated beneath them. Roxy pressed herself against the rear wall of the fallen log she'd claimed as refuge, instinctively sheltering Pip with her body. The rumble escalated into a series of harumphing snorts. Who's kicking up such a dust? Ear voice like shale sliding down a hill griped. A badger, grizzled with age and possessing a snout the color of a frosty dawn, shuffled into view. Barnaby. He was a permanent fixture in these woods, infamous for his cantankerous nature and surprising knowledge of every edible root and berry. He peered, his tiny eyes fixing on Roxy. Bobcat, he declared, the word heavy with disapproval. What are you doing hiding in this forgotten hollow? Roxy swallowed, attempting nonchalance despite her thumping heart. Just resting, Barnaby. Barnaby huffed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. Resting, you say? And what's that wretched scrap doing? He craned his neck, whiskers twitching. A kitten? A pampered house cat? Pip, jolted by the badger's booming voice, whimpered and snuggled deeper into Rox's fur. I found him, Roxy retorted, claws extending fractionally. He was abandoned. Barnaby's gaze narrowed. And you, a wildcat, nurturing a kitten? Preposterous. Utter folly. He edged closer, his bulk dominating the den's entrance. Return it. Leave it where you discovered it. It's not your concern. I can't, Roxy growled, hackles rising. He'll perish if I abandon him. He needs me. Needs you? Barnaby scoffed, a dismissive snort. Don't be absurd. He requires his own kind. He needs mother's milk, not whatever meager pickings you unearth. He regarded Pip with a flicker of what might have been pity. You struggle to sustain yourself. You'll both starve. Roxy stood her ground, muscles coiled. I'll manage. I always do. Barnaby sighed, a gust of air that disturbed Pip's fur. Stubborn, like your mother. Listen to me, Roxy. This isn't some trifling game. Winter descends soon. It will be arduous enough for you to survive, let alone a creature so ill-suited to these parts. He paused, his tone gentling slightly. I merely suggest, don't allow sentiment to be your undoing. He turned to depart, his broad form filling the aperture. "Remember my warning, bobcat. This folly will exact a price." He ambled into the undergrowth, leaving Roxy alone with her misgivings and a mewling kitten. "The storm." "Watch," Roxy murmured, her voice a low rumble that vibrated in Pip's tiny chest. She crouched low, muscles coiled, her gaze fixed on a grasshopper clinging to a tall blade of grass. Pip, all wide, emerald eyes and uncoordinated limbs, shuffled closer, mimicking her stance as best he could. The kitten's focus was less on the insect and more on Roxy. The bobcat was his whole world. Roxy twitched her tail, a silent signal, and then, in a blare of tawny fur, she pounced. The grasshopper was gone, a satisfying crunch echoing in the quiet meadow. She carried it back to Pip, dropping it at his paws. "Your turn. But be quicker this time." Pip batted clumsily at a beetle, sending it skittering away. He whined in frustration, his stomach rumbling loudly. Roxy nudged him gently. "Patience, little one. You'll get it." The air, thick with the scent of wildflowers and damp earth, suddenly shifted. The breeze, which had been a playful caress, turned sharp and insistent. Dark clouds gathered overhead, blotting out the sun. A distant rumble of thunder echoed through the hills. Roxy's ears perked up. She scanned the horizon, a primal instinct kicking in. "We need to get back," she said, her voice tight with urgency. She scooped Pip up in her jaws, careful not to hurt him, and raced towards their den, a shallow hollow beneath the roots of an ancient oak. They barely made it inside when the storm unleashed its fury. Rain lashed down in sheets, turning the meadow into a swirling grey lake. The wind howled, shaking the very foundations of the oak. Roxy huddled deeper into the den, shielding Pip with her body. But the ground was already saturated. Water began to seep in, first as a trickle, then as a steady stream. The den floor became a muddy swamp. Roxy felt a surge of panic. This wasn't just rain, this was a deluge. The water rose quickly, inching higher and higher. Pip shivered, his fur plastered to his skinny frame. He mewled, a sound barely audible above the roar of the storm. Roxy shifted him to a slightly higher spot, a small shelf of earth that was rapidly disappearing. The entrance to the den was now a raging torrent. There was no escape. Roxy knew they couldn't stay here. They would drown. She nudged Pip, trying to soothe him, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had to do something, anything, to protect him. With a desperate surge of strength, she pushed against the collapsing earth roof of the den, clawing and scrabbling until she created a small opening. The wind and rain battered her face, but she ignored it. This was their only chance. She grabbed Pip by the scruff of his neck, ignoring his terrified yelp, and plunged out into the storm. An unlikely savior. The world was dissolving. Rain lashed down, turning the forest floor into a muddy swamp. Roxy strained, Pip clutched to her back, shivering uncontrollably. The stream they'd crossed so easily yesterday was now a raging torrent, cutting off their path. She fought against the current, each step a desperate lunge. Pip mewled, a tiny, frightened sound lost in the roar of the storm. From the tangled roots of an ancient oak, a gruff voice emerged. "Well, ain't this a pickle?" Roxy, startled, almost lost her footing. She turned to see Barnaby, the old badger, his fur plastered to his frame, his nose twitching with distaste. He usually kept to himself, grumbling about the youngsters and the changing woods. She hadn't expected him to notice, let alone offer help. "We need higher ground," Roxy gasped, struggling to keep Pip dry. "The stream." Barnaby squinted. His eyes, usually narrowed in perpetual annoyance, were filled with a flicker of something akin to concern. Fool stream's more than just a stream today. Come on, follow me. I know a place. He shuffled off, surprisingly spry for his age, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. Roxy hesitated, then, with a sigh of resolve, followed. Pip whimpered again, burying his face in Rox's fur. Barnaby led them to a steep, rocky outcrop. Roxy struggled to scale it, the mud slick beneath her pores. Finally, they reached a narrow opening, almost hidden behind a curtain of ivy. In here, Barnaby grunted, disappearing inside. Roxy squeezed through, Pip still clinging tight. The cave was small, but dry. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something faintly sweet. Roxy shook the water from her fur, then gently dislodged Pip. He collapsed in a trembling heap. There, Barnaby said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. Better than gettin' washed away. He settled himself near the entrance, his back to the wind. Roxy nuzzled Pip, trying to warm him. He was still shivering. Her stomach growled, a sharp reminder of their hunger. She hadn't eaten properly in days, too focused on keeping Pip safe. Then she saw it. Tucked into a crevice in the cave wall, hidden behind a loose stone, was a small stash of nuts and berries. Enough for a decent meal. Her heart leaped with relief. Who had left it? And why? She looked at Barnaby, who was pretending to be asleep. Could it be? She nudged Pip towards the food. Eat, little one, as she murmured. We're safe now. For a little while, at least. A new family. Spring's hesitant fingers unfurled across the valley, painting the drab winter landscape with daubs of green and yellow. The biting wind still nipped, but the sun, when it dared to peek through the clouds, offered a promise of warmth. Roxy, her fur still matted from the endless rain, nudged a reluctant Pip out of the cave. The kitten, no longer a shivering ball of fluff, stretched languidly, testing his claws on the damp earth. He was growing, filling out, and his youthful clumsiness was slowly giving way to a lithe grace. The cave, once a temporary refuge, had become their home. Barnaby, the gruff old badger, hadn't returned, but the cave remained solid, the branches and mud they'd hastily packed into the gaps holding firm against the elements. Roxy suspected, though she couldn't be sure, that Barnaby had left a rabbit near the cave mouth a few nights back. She'd heard a rustling, and the distinct smell of the animal hung in the air. Pip, emboldened by his increasing size, began to explore further afield. Roxy taught him to stalk voles in the tall grass, the patience required to sit motionless, and the explosive burst of energy needed for a successful hunt. He wasn't always successful, but he learned quickly, his small body a miniature echo of Rox's movements. One sun-drenched afternoon, as Pip chased a butterfly through a field of wildflowers, a figure emerged from the tree line. Farmer Giles, a man weathered like old leather, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, stood watching. He recognized Pip immediately. The kitten had been found abandoned near his farm last autumn. He'd searched, but the storm had washed away any trace. He approached slowly, his movements deliberate, careful not to startle either animal. "Well, now," he said softly, his voice a low rumble. "Look what we have here." Roxy tensed, her body instinctively positioning herself between the farmer and Pip. A low growl rumbled in her chest. Farmer Giles held up his hands, palm open. "Easy, girl, easy. I'm not going to hurt him." He squatted down, offering Pip his open hand. The kitten, curious, cautiously approached, sniffing at the farmer's calloused fingers. Giles chuckled, a warm, genuine sound. "He's a fine lad, isn't he? Looks like he's found himself a good mother." He glanced at Roxy, his gaze lingering on the deep bond that was evident between them. He stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "I understand," he said, his voice quiet. "He's found his family." He paused, thinking. "I'll leave some milk and scraps near the old oak at the edge of the woods. Just in case. And Pip, you're welcome to visit the farm anytime you like. The chickens might not appreciate it, though." He winked. "But you're always welcome." He tipped his hat and turned to leave, his silhouette disappearing into the dappled shade of the trees. Roxy watched him go, her growl fading into a soft purr. Pip, oblivious to the significance of the encounter, continued to bat at the butterfly, his world contained within the circle of Rox's love and the boundless freedom of the valley.